Dawn crept across the stone courtyard like a reluctant witness, its pale fingers stretching through the morning mist to illuminate what no civilized soul should see. The scaffold stood stark against the grey sky, its wooden frame dark with dew and the weight of countless executions. Lady Eleanor Ashworth walked toward it with measured steps, her chin held high despite the iron shackles that bound her wrists. The crowd pressed against the wooden barriers, their faces a tapestry of hunger and horror. Some had risen before first light to claim their place, drawn by the spectacle of nobility brought low. Others came reluctantly, pulled by whispers that perhaps justice itself was on trial this morning. Eleanor's midnight blue gown, once the finest silk money could purchase, now bore the stains of her imprisonment. Yet she moved as if she wore cloth of gold, each step deliberate and dignified. Beneath the flowing fabric, she carried a secret that made each footfall precious. Twins grew within her womb, heirs to the very throne that now condemned her. "She fed my children when the harvest failed," whispered an old woman near the front, her weathered hands clutching her shawl. The murmur rippled through the common folk like water through stones. "Aye, and mine too," added a blacksmith, his voice rough with emotion. "Never asked for nothing in return, neither." The nobles in their elevated viewing platform shifted uncomfortably. Lord Camden, resplendent in his crimson doublet, leaned forward with barely concealed satisfaction. "Treason is treason," he declared loudly enough for all to hear. "Compassion poorly placed becomes conspiracy." Eleanor heard their words, but kept her gaze fixed ahead. She had known this moment would come from the instant she chose to speak for those who had no voice. In a world where mercy was seen as weakness and kindness as rebellion, she had painted herself the perfect scapegoat. The executioner waited beside his block, his face hidden behind a black hood. His axe caught the strengthening light, its edge honed to deadly perfection. Eleanor studied the weapon that would end her life and felt an unexpected calm settle over her shoulders like a familiar cloak. Then the crowd fell silent. King Henry emerged from the castle's shadow, his presence commanding absolute attention. No crown adorned his head this morning. He needed no symbol to proclaim his authority. His dark hair was pulled severely back, revealing a face carved from marble and winter storms. Those who knew him whispered of the warmth he'd once possessed. But that man seemed as distant as yesterday's sun. Eleanor turned to face her husband, her judge, her executioner. Their eyes met across the courtyard, his cold as January frost, hers burning with quiet defiance. She would not beg. She would not grovel. If he chose to destroy her, he would do so knowing exactly what he was losing. Henry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his dark eyes, doubt perhaps, or the ghost of the man he'd once been. Then his expression hardened into its familiar mask of royal indifference. The executioner raised his blade, the metal singing softly in the morning air. Eleanor closed her eyes and placed a protective hand over her belly, whispering a silent prayer for the children who would never know their father's love. "Your Majesty." The cry shattered the silence, like glass against stone. A messenger burst through the gates astride a lathered horse, a sealed parchment clutched in his trembling hand. "Your Majesty, the charges require immediate review. She is not to die, not yet." Time suspended itself between one breath and the next, the blade frozen in its deadly arc, Eleanor's heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. In that crystalline moment, she understood that her reprieve was merely another kind of prison. Eleanor had never expected to wear a crown. Born to Sir Edmund Ashworth, a baronet, whose lands yielded more rocks than gold, she'd grown up understanding that dignity was not purchased but earned. Her father had taught her to read Latin and Greek when other girls learned embroidery. Her mother had shown her which herbs could heal a fever and which could ease a difficult birth. Their manor house had been modest, its walls more familiar with laughter than luxury. Eleanor had worked alongside their few servants, tending their kitchen garden and riding out to visit tenant families when sickness struck. She learned early that true nobility lay not in bloodlines, but in service to others. Her marriage to King Henry had been arranged to heal a kingdom bleeding from internal strife. The common people had grown restless under crushing taxation, while the nobility hoarded wealth like dragons guarding gold. Eleanor was meant to be a bridge between those worlds, a queen who understood both privilege and poverty. She had entered the marriage with duty in her heart and hope in her hands, believing she could make a difference. But the royal court was a nest of vipers, dressed in silk, where compassion was viewed as weakness and mercy as political liability. When Eleanor had dared to petition for lower taxes on grain, Lord Camden and his allies had whispered of foreign influence. When she'd spoken against evicting tenant farmers, they'd called her sympathies treasonous. Henry had been different once, or so the older servants whispered, when they thought no one was listening. Before Eleanor, there had been Lady Catherine Montrose, a duke's daughter whose beauty was matched only by her intelligence. She had captured the young king's heart completely, only to be accused of conspiring with French agents. The evidence had been compelling, the betrayal devastating. Henry had ordered her execution himself, then watched the light leave her eyes from his castle window. That betrayal had transformed him from a hopeful young king into a ruler wrapped in suspicion like armor. He loved his kingdom fiercely, but trusted no one completely, least of all the wife he'd been forced to accept for political necessity. War had carved deep lines around his eyes, and the constant threat of rebellion had taught him that mercy was often mistaken for weakness. Lord Camden circled the king like a well-fed vulture, feeding on Henry's paranoia while advancing his own ambitions. He had orchestrated Eleanor's downfall with masterful precision, weaving her charitable acts into a tapestry of supposed treason. Each kindness became evidence of foreign sympathy, every reform proposal proof of revolutionary intent. Margaret, Eleanor's childhood friend and loyal lady's maid, watched the proceedings with a heart heavy as stone. She alone knew the truth of Eleanor's condition, had helped conceal the pregnancy when morning sickness struck. Margaret understood that her mistress carried not just children but the future of the realm itself. Reverend Armsley, the castle's elderly chaplain, had baptized Eleanor into the faith, but now trembled at the thought of speaking in her defense. He had seen too many good men and women disappear into the tower for less than what he might say. The reprieve had bought Eleanor life, but not freedom. As the guards escorted her back to the castle, she felt the weight of hostile stares from the noble gallery. Her survival was an inconvenience they would not long tolerate. Henry remained on the scaffold platform long after the crowd had dispersed, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared at the spot where Eleanor had stood. His advisor, Lord Pemberton, approached cautiously. "Your Majesty, perhaps. Mercy will prove my gravest mistake," Henry muttered, his voice carrying on the wind like a funeral dirge. Eleanor, passing beneath an open window, heard those words and felt them settle in her chest like ice. She pressed her hand to her stomach, where new life grew despite the darkness surrounding them. Her children would need more than her love to survive. They would need their father to remember how to trust. The investigation would buy her time, but time was a luxury she could not waste. Somehow she had to pierce the armor Henry had built around his heart and show him the truth before Camden's poison claimed them all. The king's private study smelled of old leather and burning wax, its heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon light. Eleanor stood before Henry's massive oak desk, her hands folded calmly, despite the tremor that threatened to betray her composure. 2 guards flanked the door, their presence a reminder that she remained a prisoner despite her reprieve. Henry did not look up from the documents scattered before him, his quill scratching methodically across parchment. The silence stretched between them like a bowstring drawn taut, each second adding weight to the tension. "You may sit," he said finally, not raising his eyes. "I prefer to stand, Your Majesty." Now he did look up, and Eleanor felt the full force of his scrutiny. His dark eyes searched her face as if seeking some crack in her composure, some sign of the guilt he expected to find. "You stand accused of corresponding with enemies of the crown," he began, his voice carrying the formal weight of judgment, "of conspiring to undermine royal authority through seditious acts disguised as charity. What say you to these charges?" Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "I say that feeding the hungry has never been treason, nor has speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves." "Pretty words," Henry replied, leaning back in his chair. "But pretty words have toppled kingdoms before now. Your charitable activities coincided remarkably well with increased unrest among the peasants. Perhaps because kindness breeds hope, and hope breeds courage to seek justice." The quill snapped between Henry's fingers, ink splattering across the parchment like drops of blood. "Justice? You speak to me of justice while accused of betraying your king, your country, your marriage vows." Eleanor's composure finally cracked, fire flashing in her grey eyes. "I would rather meet death in honesty than life in submission to lies. If compassion is my crime, then I am guilty as charged." Henry rose slowly, moving around the desk until only an arm's length separated them. This close, Eleanor could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, the burden of kingship carved into his features like scars. "You speak of honesty," he said softly, dangerously. "Yet you hide things from me. Even now, I can see it in your eyes, in the way you hold yourself. What secrets do you carry, Eleanor?" Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "The only secret I carry is the depth of my disappointment in the man I married." The words hung between them like a sword blade, sharp and cutting. Henry's jaw tightened, but something else flickered across his features, uncertainty perhaps, or the faintest touch of shame. "You will remain within the castle walls," he said finally, stepping back behind the safety of his desk. "Under guard at all times. You will have no contact with the outside world until this investigation concludes. And if the investigation proves my innocence..." Henry's smile held no warmth. "Then you will have learned the value of discretion." Eleanor curtsied with perfect form, the gesture somehow managing to convey both respect and defiance. "As your Majesty commands." She turned toward the door, then paused without looking back. "You have forgotten something, my lord." "And what is that?" "You have forgotten how to see the difference between loyalty and betrayal. When you remember, I pray it will not be too late." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Henry alone with her words echoing in the sudden silence. He sank into his chair, running a hand through his dark hair as her image burned behind his closed eyes, composed, dignified, utterly unbroken despite everything he had put her through. Outside the study, Eleanor leaned against the stone wall for a moment, allowing herself to feel the tremor that had threatened her throughout their confrontation. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the twins rested safe within her womb. "You must live," she whispered to them, her voice barely audible in the empty corridor. "For he will not yet see what he is destroying. But perhaps there is still time to teach him." The guards fell into step behind her as she made her way to her chambers, their footsteps echoing off the ancient stones. Eleanor walked with her head high, dignity intact despite the chains of suspicion that bound her. The game was far from over, and she had every intention of winning, not for herself, but for the children who would inherit whatever world their parents chose to create. The kitchen gardens had become Eleanor's sanctuary, a place where she could work with her hands and remember who she had been before crowns and accusations. Under the watchful eyes of her guards, she tended the herb beds with the same careful attention she had once given her father's modest grounds. Henry found her there on a grey morning, kneeling beside a patch of lavender, with soil dark beneath her fingernails. She wore a simple brown dress, servant's clothing, that somehow made her seem more regal than any court gown. "The cook tells me you've been managing the household accounts," he said without preamble. Eleanor didn't look up from her work. "Someone had to. Your steward has been stealing from the pantry stores." "You found discrepancies?" "I found that the servants' children were going hungry while your nobles feast on 7 courses. She sat back on her heels, finally meeting his eyes. "Is that not also a form of treason, Your Majesty, to steal food from the mouths of those who serve you?" Henry stepped closer, studying the neat rows of herbs she had cultivated. "You learned this from your mother?" "She taught me that healing begins in the garden." Eleanor's voice softened slightly. "That sometimes the cure for what ails us grows right beneath our feet, if we have the wisdom to recognize it." Their hands brushed as she reached for her basket, and both froze at the unexpected contact. Henry felt the roughness of honest work on her palms, the warmth of living flesh beneath skin that had grown too pale during her imprisonment. Eleanor felt the strength in his fingers, the calluses that spoke of a king who still knew how to hold a sword. They pulled apart quickly, but the moment lingered between them like heat from a banked fire. The formal dinner that evening proved a trial by social fire. Eleanor sat at Henry's right hand, enduring the whispered comments and calculating stares of the assembled nobles. Lord Camden held court at the far end of the table, his voice carrying just far enough for her to catch fragments of his poison. Unnatural influence over His Majesty. Common blood will tell in the end. Should have let justice take its course. Henry's jaw tightened with each veiled insult, his knuckles white around his wine goblet. When Lady Pemberton made a particularly cutting remark about foreign loyalties, he set down his cup with enough force to silence the table. "Perhaps Lady Eleanor would honor us with her thoughts on the evening's entertainment," he said, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that made courtiers tremble. The musicians in the gallery struck up a pavan, its stately rhythm filling the sudden silence. Henry rose and extended his hand to Eleanor, his dark eyes challenging anyone to object. "My lady." Eleanor placed her hand in his, acutely aware of every eye upon them as he led her to the center of the hall. The dance was a courtly one, full of prescribed steps and formal movements, but something electric crackled between them as they moved through its patterns. "You needn't defend me," Eleanor murmured as they came together in the dance's embrace. "I defend my queen," Henry replied, his breath warm against her ear. "It is my right. Your queen or your prisoner." His step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps there is less difference than I thought." The dance continued, but Eleanor felt something shift between them, a crack in the wall Henry had built around his heart, small but significant. When the music ended, he bowed formally over her hand, but his eyes held questions he was not yet ready to ask. Later that night, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The library drew her like a moth to flame, its vast collection of books offering escape from the suffocating atmosphere of court. She had not expected to find Henry there, seated by the dying fire with a volume of poetry open on his lap. "Chaucer?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him without invitation. "The Wife of Bath's Tale." His smile held irony rather than warmth. "A story about what women truly want." And what does she conclude? Sovereignty over their own lives. Henry closed the book, studying Eleanor across the firelight. Tell me, what is it that you want, Eleanor? What would you choose if you could have anything in the world? The question hung between them, more intimate than any touch. Eleanor felt the weight of honesty pressing against her lips, demanding release. I want to matter, she said finally, to live a life that leaves the world better than I found it. To love and be loved without reservation or calculation. She paused, meeting his eyes, to trust and be trusted in return. Henry was quiet for a long moment, the fire painting shadows across his sharp features. Trust is a luxury kings cannot afford. Then perhaps the problem lies not with trust, but with kingship itself. Before he could respond, Eleanor rose and moved toward the door. But as she passed his chair, she paused, her hand coming to rest briefly on his shoulder. Even kings need someone to trust, Henry. Someone who sees the man beneath the crown. She left him there in the dying firelight, but she felt his eyes following her until she disappeared into the corridor's shadows. In her chambers, Eleanor pressed her hands to her belly, where the twins grew stronger each day. Soon her secret would be impossible to hide. But tonight, for the first time since her arrest, she dared to hope that when Henry learned the truth, it would not be her death warrant he signed. The whispers began at dawn like poison seeping through castle stones. By mid-morning they had reached Henry's ears, carried by Lord Camden with the gleeful malice of a man watching his carefully laid plans come to fruition. Your Majesty, Camden said, his voice heavy with false regret, there are disturbing rumors circulating about the Queen's condition. Henry looked up from the dispatches scattered across his desk, his expression unreadable. What manner of rumors? It is said she carries a child, but the timing... Camden paused for calculated effect. The timing suggests the father cannot be Your Majesty. The parchment crumpled in Henry's grip, the royal seal cracking beneath the pressure of his fingers. Explain. The French envoy, Your Majesty. He was at court during the time in question. Several witnesses now recall seeing them together, speaking in hushed tones. Her charitable activities provided perfect cover for clandestine meetings. Henry rose slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury that made Camden step back involuntarily. The king had learned to master his rage over the years, to channel it into cold precision rather than hot violence. It made him infinitely more dangerous. Witnesses, Henry repeated, his voice soft as silk over steel. How convenient that their memories have suddenly become so clear. But even as he spoke the words, Henry felt the familiar poison of doubt seeping through his veins. Catherine had betrayed him with just such careful planning, just such attention to detail. The evidence against her had been overwhelming until the moment her head fell beneath the executioner's axe. Eleanor was in the garden when the guards came for her, their faces grim with uncomfortable duty. She had been expecting this moment, had felt it approaching like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Her hands moved protectively to her belly, where the twins seemed to sense their mother's distress. They brought her to the throne room, where Henry sat rigid upon his carved seat of power. The assembled court watched with hungry eyes as she approached, their whispers following her like carrion birds. Lord Camden stood at the king's right hand, his satisfaction barely concealed behind a mask of noble concern. Kneel, commanded the herald, but Eleanor remained standing, her chin raised in quiet defiance. Henry studied her with eyes like winter storms, searching for signs of guilt in the pale composure of her face. You are accused of adultery and treason against the crown, of carrying a bastard child and claiming it as royal blood. Eleanor felt the words like physical blows, but her voice remained steady. I am accused of many things, Your Majesty. Which of them do you choose to believe? The evidence is compelling, Camden interjected. Your condition cannot be denied, and the timing, Eleanor interrupted, her grey eyes flashing with sudden fire, proves nothing save that mathematics serves those who would twist it to their purpose. Henry leaned forward, his knuckles white against the throne's arms. Then you deny carrying a child? Eleanor's hand moved to her belly, where the secret she had guarded so carefully now seemed to burn through her gown. Would you destroy your children because you cannot conquer your fear? The words rang through the throne room like a bell tolling doom. Henry's face went white, then red with fury that came not from certainty but from the terrible possibility that he was about to repeat his greatest mistake. My children? His voice cracked like a whip. You dare claim? I claim nothing but the truth you refuse to see. Eleanor stepped closer to the throne, ignoring the gasps from the assembled nobles. These children are yours, Henry. Conceived in duty, perhaps, but yours nonetheless, and you would kill them as you killed. Silence! Henry's roar echoed off the vaulted ceiling. You will not speak her name, you will not dare. But Eleanor had found her courage in the depths of desperation. As you killed Catherine without listening to her pleas, as you will kill me without seeking proof beyond the word of those who profit from my death. The throne room fell deadly silent. To invoke Catherine's name was to touch the rawest nerve in Henry's scarred heart, to force him to confront the possibility that his greatest act of justice had been his greatest sin. Remove her, Henry commanded, his voice hollow with remembered pain. Confine her to the tower. No visitors, no contact with anyone until he stopped, unable to finish the sentence that would seal her fate. Eleanor curtsied with perfect grace, even as the guards moved to flank her. As your majesty commands, but know that when you destroy me, you destroy the last hope of healing the wounds that bleed us all. They led her away through corridors that seemed to stretch like a funeral march, past servants who wept openly and nobles who watched with glittering eyes. Eleanor kept her head high until the tower door closed behind her, shutting out the light and the world beyond. In the sudden darkness, she finally allowed herself to weep, not for herself but for the children who might never draw breath, and for the man she loved who was destroying himself one betrayal at a time. Henry remained on his throne long after the court had dispersed, staring at the place where Eleanor had stood. Her words echoed in the empty hall, mixing with memories of another woman's final plea for mercy. He had been so certain then, so sure that justice demanded blood. But what if certainty was just another word for fear? The summons came at dawn. Urgent word that Eleanor had collapsed in her tower cell, her body racked with the kind of pain that threatened not just her life, but the lives she carried. Henry took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering with a terror he hadn't felt since Catherine's execution. He found Eleanor pale as winter frost, Margaret kneeling beside the narrow bed where she lay unconscious. The loyal maid looked up at the king, with eyes bright with tears and accusation. She's been bleeding, your majesty. The strain, the children may not survive. Henry knelt beside the bed, his hands hovering over Eleanor's still form, as if his touch might shatter her completely. In the grey light filtering through the tower's single window, he saw what his anger had blinded him to, the gentle curve of her belly where his hairs grew, the exhaustion etched in lines around her eyes, the way her hands curved protectively even in unconsciousness. Fetch the physician, he commanded hoarsely. The best we have, spare no expense. But as Margaret hurried away, Henry remained kneeling beside Eleanor's bed, confronting the magnitude of what he had almost done. If she died, if the children died, it would not be justice but murder, and he would be the killer. The council chamber erupted in chaos, when Henry burst through its doors like an avenging angel. Lords who had been plotting Eleanor's destruction suddenly found themselves facing a king whose fury burned with the cold fire of absolute certainty. "You have lied to me," Henry announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. "All of you fed me poison disguised as truth, and watched while I drank it down." Lord Camden rose smoothly, his face a mask of injured innocence. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot believe the desperate claims of a condemned traitor." "I believe the evidence of my own eyes," Henry cut him off. "The timing you spoke of so convincingly places conception squarely within my marriage to the Queen. The children are mine." But the French envoy, another lord, began. "Spoke with the Queen about grain shipments for the poor, as the port records clearly show." Henry's smile was sharp as a blade. Strange how such charitable work can be twisted into conspiracy by those with sufficient motivation. The king's eyes swept the assembled nobles, cataloguing their guilt and complicity. "If my queen is guilty of treason, then so am I, for I doubted her without proof, condemned her without trial, and nearly destroyed the very thing I swore to protect." Camden's composure finally cracked. "Your Majesty cannot mean to—" "I strip you of your titles and lands," Henry announced, his voice ringing with royal authority. "You will be escorted from my kingdom and never return on pain of death. As for the rest of you who supported this charade, pray that your future service proves more honorable than your recent past." The nobles scattered like leaves before a storm, their whispered protests dying in their throats. Henry stood alone in the chamber where he had nearly signed his wife's death warrant, feeling the weight of his own fallibility pressing down upon his shoulders. Eleanor woke to find sunlight streaming through tall windows instead of the tower's grey gloom. She lay in their marriage bed, surrounded by the familiar comforts of the royal chambers she had thought never to see again. Henry sat beside her, his face haggard with sleeplessness and worry. "The children?" she whispered, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "Safe," Henry replied, catching her fingers in his own. "The physician says they are strong, like their mother." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the cracks in the armor he had worn for so long. "You believe me?" "I believe I have been a fool." Henry's grip tightened on her hand as if she might disappear if he let go. "I nearly destroyed everything that mattered, because I could not see past my own fear." "Henry, let me finish," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I have spent so long guarding against betrayal that I created it where none existed. I condemned Catherine without listening, and I nearly condemned you the same way." Eleanor pushed herself upright despite his protests, her grey eyes searching his face. "What will you do now?" "What I should have done from the beginning," Henry replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "I will trust you. I will listen. And I will try to become worthy of the love you have shown me, even when I deserved none." He knelt beside the bed then, this proud king who bowed to no mortal authority, and pressed his forehead to her hand. "Can you forgive me, Eleanor? Can you love a man who nearly destroyed his own happiness through stubborn pride?" Eleanor freed her hand to cup his face, feeling the dampness of tears he had finally allowed himself to shed. "I already do," she whispered. "I have loved the man beneath the crown from the moment I first saw him. I was only waiting for you to let him emerge." Henry rose to gather her in his arms, holding her with the desperate tenderness of a man who had glimpsed loss and chose love instead. Outside their chamber, the sun climbed higher in a sky that seemed brighter than it had in months, promising better days ahead for a kingdom learning to heal. Summer had painted the castle gardens in shades of gold and green, transforming the courtyard where Eleanor had once faced death into a place of life and laughter. She sat beneath the ancient oak tree, twin infants cradled in her arms, Prince Edmund and Princess Catherine, named for the grandparents they would never meet but whose legacy of love they would carry forward. Henry approached across the sun-dappled grass, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The crown still rested heavily on his brow, but the burden of kingship no longer seemed to crush his soul. He had learned the difference between strength and stubbornness, between protection and paranoia. The council meeting went well, Eleanor asked as he settled beside her on the blanket. Margaret had spread beneath the tree. Better than expected, Henry replied, reaching out to stroke his daughter's downy cheek. The tax reforms have taken hold in 3 more counties. The harvest reports are promising. It had been a slow transformation, but the kingdom was healing from the wounds of suspicion and fear. Henry's public acknowledgement of his own mistakes had shocked the nobility into reconsidering their own actions. The common people, who had always known Eleanor's worth, welcomed their king's newfound wisdom with cautious hope. Lord Pemberton still grumbles about the changes, Henry continued with wry amusement. He insists that compassion will bankrupt the crown. And what do you tell him? That a kingdom built on the suffering of its people is already bankrupt in all the ways that matter. Henry's smile held warmth that would have been unimaginable months earlier. I find myself quoting my wife rather frequently in council these days. Eleanor laughed, the sound like silver bells in the summer air. How the mighty have fallen, from absolute monarch to henpecked husband. Gladly, Henry replied without hesitation. I have learned that true strength lies not in ruling through fear, but in earning the love and loyalty of those we serve. Young Edmund stirred in his mother's arms, his tiny fist waving with royal determination. Henry reached out to let his son grasp his finger, marveling at the strength in such small hands. He will be a better king than his father, Henry murmured. He will be a different king, Eleanor corrected gently. One who learns from his father's wisdom as well as his mistakes. A small procession approached across the garden, Margaret leading a group of village children who had come to see the royal twins. The youngsters clustered around the blanket with wide eyes and careful reverence, whispering their amazement at the babies who would one day rule them. Will they be like their mama? Asked a gap-toothed girl who remembered Eleanor's kindness during the hungry winter. Will they help us when we need it? Eleanor exchanged a meaningful look with Henry before answering. They will learn that true nobility comes not from birth, but from service. That the greatest privilege of power is using it to lift others up. As the afternoon wore on, courtiers and common folk alike made their way through the gardens, drawn by the rare sight of their royal family relaxing in public. There were no barriers between king and subject here, no protocol to maintain distance. Henry had discovered that strength lay not in separation but in connection. Do you ever miss it? Eleanor asked as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western walls. The certainty you once had, the simplicity of seeing the world in absolutes. Henry considered the question seriously, his dark eyes reflecting the golden light. I miss the safety it seemed to offer, but I would not trade the complexity of truth for the comfort of delusion. Eleanor nodded, understanding completely. The world was messier now, full of nuance and possibility rather than rigid rules. But it was also richer, more vibrant, more alive with potential. As evening painted the sky in shades of rose and purple, Henry helped Eleanor to her feet, their children drowsing contentedly in their arms. They walked slowly back toward the castle, followed by the blessing and goodwill of their people. What happens next? Eleanor asked as they paused in the courtyard where their story had nearly ended in tragedy. Henry looked around at the place where he had almost lost everything that mattered, then back at the woman who had saved him from himself. We continue forward, we love without reservation, we rule with wisdom instead of fear. He paused, his voice growing soft with wonder. We build something better than what came before. Eleanor smiled up at him, her heart full of the contentment that comes from battles fought and won. Together, Henry confirmed, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings. Above them, stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, bearing witness to a love that had survived suspicion and fear to emerge stronger than ever. In the castle gardens, night-blooming flowers opened their petals to the moon's silver light, and somewhere in the distance a nightingale sang of joy and redemption. The kingdom that had once trembled on the edge of division now stood united under rulers who had learned that true strength came not from crushing opposition, but from building bridges. Eleanor and Henry walked toward their future hand in hand, carrying their children and their hopes into a tomorrow bright with promise. Love had not erased the scars of the past, but it had transformed them into sources of wisdom and compassion. In learning to trust each other, they had discovered how to lead a nation toward healing and hope. The crown's mercy had become the kingdom's salvation, and mercy, Eleanor knew, was just another word for love.